My name is Joe Kim, and along with David Shore, we're the co-organizers of the McMaster Symposium on Cognition, Learning, and Education. As students, educators, and policymakers, we're all invested in student success and developing the habit of lifelong learning. And to this list, I think we can also safely add parents of students and future students. The first event of this symposium is tonight's keynote lecture and panel discussion, which is presented as part of the McMaster Seminar on Higher Education by the Office of the President. Tonight's keynote speaker will be introduced by McMaster University President Patrick Dean. Patrick Dean became President and Vice Chancellor of McMaster University in July 2010. He is also a professor in the Department of English and Cultural Studies. As President, he's focused on enhancing the student experience, integrating community engagement into the work of the Academy, and ensuring the continuation of a wide range of high-quality research. I would now like to welcome Patrick Dean to the stage to introduce our keynote speaker for tonight, Dr. John Dunlosky.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's seminar. As Joe has explained, tonight's event is a collaboration, exactly the kind of collaboration that we seek to foster here, between the Symposium on Cognition, Learning and Education and the McMaster Seminar on Higher Education, an initiative that's been underway now for a couple of years. The Seminar on Higher Education, Practice, Policy and the Public Life, as the subtitle goes, is a lecture series presented by the Office of the President with the aim of inspiring critical thought within the McMaster and the broader Hamilton communities. It's a way of ensuring that we spend a lot of time thinking about the business of the university in the most rigorous ways. It's intended that the topics of the seminar series will be timely, interdisciplinary, far-reaching, and guided by the key questions and challenges facing higher education institutions and the communities they serve. So this evening's event is the third of this year's set of 7 seminars. The next is a panel discussion which is taking place in January and has the title Decolonizing the Academy, Creating Spaces for Indigenous Knowledge. You can find out more information about that lecture and other upcoming ones and previous lectures by visiting our website, highered.mcmaster.ca. So it's my pleasure now to introduce tonight's speaker. Joe Kim rather enigmatically told me that I would find him very Canadian because he seems to be extremely polite. I thought to myself, this is a very Canadian insight of Joe's in itself. It's strange that we are preoccupied by that as a human virtue. Dr. John Dunlosky is a professor of psychology at Kent State University, where he has taught since 2004. He has contributed work on memory and metacognition, including theories of self-regulated learning and metacomprehension. Since his postdoctoral training at Georgia Institute of Technology, he has explored people's metacognitive capabilities and how to improve them. A major aim of his research program is to develop techniques to improve the effectiveness of people's self-regulated learning across the lifespan. A fellow of the Association for Psychological Science, he is a founder of the International Association for Metacognition. He co-authored Metacognition, which is the first textbook on the topic, and has edited several books on metacognition and education. And he also serves as an associate editor for the Psychonomic Bulletin and Review. So please join me in welcoming John Dunlosky.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction. It's just wonderful to be here today. It's my first time at McMaster. I'm having a great time. Psych department is wonderful, and I want to thank Joe Kim and David Shore for actually inviting me to give this address tonight. And today, basically, I'm going to just talk a little bit about a variety of different techniques that students can use to potentially boost their success in the classroom, and going to describe some principles of cognitive psychology as we go. So what I want to begin with, before I get into some of these strategies that students can use to improve their achievement, is describe a little bit about a problem for education. And admittedly, these data come from the United States, but you'll see they generalize pretty well to students all across the globe. Turns out we have a national assessment of education progress that's administered every 3 or 4 years to both 8th graders and 12th graders. And these tests are given nationwide, and they evaluate students' ability and knowledge on science, mathematics, reading, history, I think aesthetics, many, many different domains. And what I have here is basically one question from the 8th grade science test. So Kelly slides a rock across the smooth ice of a frozen pond. The rock slows down after several seconds. What causes the rock to slow down? Any answers from the audience, studio? Unfortunately, I'm hearing lots of different answers, but in fact, it turns out 8th graders too in the United States give lots of different answers to this question, okay? What I'm going to do is show you basically stacked plots that separate students with respect to whether they achieved a below basic level of performance, a basic level, proficient, or advanced. And I'm going to show you data from math, science, reading, and history. And obviously, hopefully most of the students in 8th grade will be at a basically either proficient or advanced level. Okay. So there are 2 ways to look at these figures. In my times of optimism, I start at the top. Okay? And if you start at the top and go down, you'll see that about 30% of the students in 8th grade are achieving at least a proficient or advanced level of performance, math, science, and reading. Unfortunately, if you start at the bottom of the graph and move up, you'll note that about 30% of these 8th graders aren't even achieving a basic level of performance across these different domains. Not good, okay? We're leaving some students behind in the educational system. Now, we administer the same versions of these tests to 12th graders as well, again, across the nation, and you might expect that the values would get quite a bit better. For one reason, we're identifying maybe those students who need help, and we can basically give them more instruction so they can remediate their misunderstanding. And unfortunately, we know at least some of these students will drop out of high school, hence kind of artificially kind of improving performance. However, things don't get better in the 12th grade. In fact, now, students are about 30% or more of the students aren't achieving a basic level of performance for math, science, and reading. Here, obviously, we really don't teach U.S. history anymore to students, or they don't really attend in class, because really, many of the students aren't achieving a basic level of proficiency. Now, it turns out that even though these values are from the United States, students, and get made a lot of fun of, the U.S. gets poked fun of all the time because our students, as you guys probably know, aren't performing well globally with these kinds of tests, okay? But it really doesn't matter your country of origin. We know that students across the globe often struggle with their studies, and even the students who do relatively well certainly potentially could use better strategies and become more efficient studiers. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about today are a variety of different study skills that students could potentially adopt to improve their achievement. I'll first give everyone kind of a bird's eye view of different studies that you can use, and then most of my talk will focus on these 3 specific strategies: retrieval practice, distributed practice, and then their offspring, successive relearning. And then I'll end with a couple conclusions. So, as a quick side note, really focused on evidence-based education reform. So everything I'm going to talk about today is based on a relatively large evidence base, so please bear with me, I will be presenting data. And the good news is that there's lots of evidence about the effectiveness of a whole variety of strategies. And in one really excellent book by John Hattie called Visible Learning, which I highly recommend you grab if you're interested in basically a variety of factors that relate to student achievement, he basically reviewed 138 different factors and the degree to which they relate to better student achievement. And I want to keep emphasizing this. He didn't ask, do students like these factors? He didn't ask teachers whether the teachers thought that the students were benefiting from these. No, these are factors and their relationship to actual student outcome. Now, 138 factors is a whole lot. I can't go through all of them tonight. What I want to do is just give you a little pastiche about what Hattie found. Okay, so I'm going to start with just 2 of these factors that, for me, I was surprised that they got such a low ranking. So 2 factors that have a relatively minor influence on student achievement are class size and teacher training. So smaller class sizes don't always lead to better achievement. In fact, they don't often lead to better student achievement. And the more teacher training you have, you would think the student achievement would go up, but it doesn't always help. And in fact, these numbers in parentheses here are where these two factors were ranked ordered in the 138. So these really had a relatively minor influence or relationship with actual student achievement. Now what I'm going to do is reveal a couple of the factors that were highly ranked. The top 30 included obtaining formative evaluation. This is when a teacher takes the time to evaluate how much each student understands about a particular content and then gears their teaching toward the student's particular needs. Reciprocal teaching is just when students teach each other content in the classroom. Distributed practice is a kind of strategy I'll be talking a lot today about. And then a variety of metacognitive strategies and study skills are highly related to student achievement. Okay. Now, the fact that some of these things are actually good and help student performance gives us a little insight into why class size and teacher training may not be that effective. Okay. Just imagine yourself like in a classroom teaching about 40 high school students AP biology. Okay. You're teaching a large class, and then all of a sudden you have an expensive school reform where you go from class size of 40 to a class size of 10. I mean, most students would tell you, well, that's really going to lead to better achievement. The difficulty, though, if you're given this small class size and you don't take advantage, you just use your kind of teaching style that you've always used, students aren't going to perform any better. That is, if you don't take advantage of the small class size to obtain formative evaluation, right, to use reciprocal teaching, then nothing will change. Similarly, with teacher training, well, if teachers aren't being trained the right kinds of strategies to help students out, right, of course, the teacher training is not going to be potent. Okay? Now again, I highly recommend anyone interested in improving student achievement, and I don't work for John Hattie, believe me, go out and grab this book. It's a really easy read. It has a separate chapter on all 138 factors. The good news is each chapter comes with a little figure you can look at to see how effective. So you just flip right through. I read it in one night. It's wonderful. Okay. One thing, though, this is a meta-analysis. Okay? So basically, it averages over a lot of the details of what works. So here we find that metacognitive strategies and study skills are relatively highly related to student achievement. But this doesn't explicitly say which study skills are the best. And we know all study skills and strategies aren't created equally. So about 3 years ago, we set out to evaluate which study strategies actually work. And basically, we're commissioned to do basically reviews of the entire literature. And I had a large team working with me, Catherine Rawson, Beth Marsh, Mitch Nathan, and Dan Willingham, to basically exhaustively review these literatures to evaluate which techniques are the best. The first chore we had was to choose which techniques to even review. We decided that we would not be reviewing any techniques that required technology. We know a variety of auto tutors can be really beneficial to students, but they just won't be available to all students because they're expensive. So we only evaluated those techniques that were free. At worst, you'd need a pencil and paper to utilize them. Okay. And these are the 10 strategies we came up with right here. Some of these strategies we chose because, quite frankly, we thought they would be beneficial to students. Gut hunch was that the prevailing evidence would suggest they would work, but we wanted to go out and actually evaluate whether they worked. A variety of these other strategies, however, we chose because we knew students used them. For instance, highlighting and rereading. Everybody in this auditorium was a student or is a student. And I would ask you all to raise your hand if you used a highlighter, but if you didn't raise your hand, I'm not saying you're a liar, but I don't believe you. Everybody uses highlighters. I still have my favorite highlighter that I would never get rid of. Okay? So it's a technique that many students use, and what our question was, well, does it really help them? Is it really beneficial? Another technique that we thought many students used was just simply rereading. They'll go back to their notes and reread their notes to get ready for an exam. And research by Jeff Kripicki, published in 2009, just asked students, well, what do you do when you get ready to for an exam? How do you study? And this was a survey conducted at Washington University, so these are relatively elite student body. And by far, the strategy that most of these students endorsed was going back to reread. Some students said they practiced problems, some said that they used flashcards, but almost every student endorsed rereading as a strategy of choice. Okay? The question is, how good is rereading? Does it really benefit students? Also with this review, we really set out to do an exhaustive review of the entire literature. It took us 2 years to review the literatures for each of these strategies. Okay? When we were looking at the literature, we were asking ourselves the following questions. Does this strategy improve students' performance not only in the laboratory, but also in the classroom? Is there evidence to indicate that the strategy can be used by a wide variety of students of all ages and abilities? Okay? Does the strategy also not only help students remember key content in a classroom, but it does also help them comprehend that content? And really, to get high marks from our particular review, you needed to score really well on all of those different areas. So the question had to be, yes, it does help students of all ages. Yes, it does improve learning and comprehension and so forth. And what I'm going to do now is just reveal kind of our end game here, like how we rated the utility of these strategies. So some of these got relatively low ratings. Summarization, highlighting, keyword mnemonic, and admittedly, many of these strategies will benefit students in specific context. We know imagery can help, and summarization, if you have quite a bit of training, can help a student learning. It's just that these strategies really weren't broadly applicable. They wouldn't help all students, and they certainly don't help all students learn all kinds of content. So we rated them relatively low. Now, some of them, however, like highlighting, got a low utility rating because it really doesn't help at all, okay? The evidence suggests that highlighting doesn't improve students' performance. I would never tell a student to get rid of their highlighters. Please, if you're a highlighter salesman, I'm not against you here, okay? But the idea is that highlighting your text as you're reading it should not be the beginning of the learning journey, it's the start. And it's what you do afterwards, after you've identified what you need to learn, that's going to help students effectively learn that content. Note also that rereading has low utility as well, okay, which kind of is confusing because most students use rereading to study. Okay. And in some context, it can boost or help them learn content. But now I can give you kind of an intuition about why we think rereading doesn't work that well. Imagine most students study the night before an exam called cramming. I'll talk about that a little bit today. And they're studying their notes, and their eyes are moving across the page, and their mind is wandering somewhere in space, probably thinking about what I'm going to do after I finish this test, okay? Rereading itself isn't that engaging. It doesn't really promote active processing. Now, a variety of these strategies we gave a moderate rating to. I'm not going to talk about these today. If you'd like to learn more about them, my email will be at the end of this talk. Please write me, and I'll send you basically evidence and discussion about these moderate utility strategies. Instead, I want to focus on the good ones, those that had really high utility, and that's practice testing and distributed practice. About 100 years of research has shown that these two strategies can benefit students of all ages and of many different content areas. They're kind of an all-purpose strategies that can be used in many different ways. So now we're kind of into the bulk of my talk. I'm going to get basically specifics about these strategies. Bear with me. I'm going to show you some evidence about how well they work and talk a little bit about how students and teachers could implement or use them both in the classroom as well as when you're studying in the dormitory. So retrieval practice. What is retrieval practice? It's test taking. Test is a 4-letter word. Students don't like it. Many teachers don't like tests. It's like panic. I mean, when I think of test taking, this is what I see. Large auditorium, the students are sweating. It's a high stakes test. How I perform on this is going to basically mark me for graduate school or not so graduate school, right? We need to give these kinds of tests, and we give them to evaluate, right, how much students have learned. But what many teachers and students don't realize is that test taking can provide a potent increase or can enhance learning as well as just evaluate learning. And what I mean here, practice tests can come in all different varieties. So when a student is getting ready for an exam, they can take a practice multiple choice test, fill in the blank test, essay-style recall test, basically to practice for the upcoming exam. And by basically taking these tests, okay, it has added benefit to their long-term retention and comprehension of that material. Okay. So let me make this a little bit more concrete by stepping you through a couple of experiments. And the first was conducted by Jeff Karpicki, published a couple years ago, and he had students learning simple foreign language translation equivalents. I mean, it's kind of a stimuli of cognitive psychologist's choice. We like to use these simple associations, but this is something that students, they need to learn a lot of these kinds of materials. And he had them study 60 Swahili English translation equivalents. All the students in this study studied all of these items once. They just went through, like a set of flashcards, and studied each one. Then he had two different groups. One group involved studying that list 4 times. Studying it once, studying it twice, 3, 4. The other group, however, he replaced the study attempt with a test attempt. Okay? So you test, then you'd study all those items again, test and study. Just to give you a sense about what that would look like, again, very much like flashcards. Vumbi, does anyone know the translation equivalent for that? Dust, okay, someone in the audience. Less so, stop. She's a collaborator, she knows all of these. Okay? So you test yourself on all of these particular items, and then again, you just study them all. Okay? Relatively straightforward. What I love about this study and others that I'll describe today is the time on task here was identical. Okay? Students are using the same amount of time whether they're studying or whether they're testing. Also, in this context, you might think that testing is a really bad idea, right? Because if you don't actually recall a translation equivalent here, you lose out on the opportunity you would have had to study it here. So we might think that testing really could undermine students' overall performance. Let me show you what he found. Of course, he had a final recall test after these trials. This is final recall, the percent correct, and when you studied it 4 times over, they recalled about 60% of these relatively difficult translation equivalents. However, by replacing 2 of those study trials with a test trial, performance is substantially increased. Same amount of time, much better performance. Okay? Now, these are relatively simple materials, but it turns out in the last 5 to 10 years, many researchers have been showing that practice tests can also boost students' learning and comprehension of relatively difficult or complex materials. And this study is one conducted by Andrew Butler, published several years ago. I believe this was his dissertation. And he had students begin by studying basically science text. So one of these texts was on bats and bat echolocation. They're 1,000-word text. I think there were about 8 paragraphs, okay? Something that you could pull right out of a science textbook. Then there were 2 different groups, test restudy group or a restudy only group. And for these tests, basically would ask people to recall certain concepts or facts from the particular science text. So one fact is just how many species of bats are in the world. The answer to this is over 1,000. They're really prolific, those little guys, okay? And a concept would be, well, for those bats who use echolocation, in fact, how do they basically determine distance of objects or their size? Relatively complicated. So we'd have students either test and then restudy that same material, or just have students restudy. And again, the time on task was the same. So these students spent just as much time studying as these students did testing and then restudying. 1 week later, he had the students come back and have a final test where he asked relatively difficult and new inference-based questions. Okay. So a couple things to point out here. This is final test performance, and note, in this case, that people are performing much better when they use some of their time to use practice test than when they basically just restudy the material. That occurs for facts. The same outcome occurs for these difficult concepts, and then he replicated this multiple times. Again, in this context, time on task was the same, so using that basically testing with restudy just has a potent influence on students' long-term retention of this science content. Okay. Retrieval practice. when is it most effective? Well, again, there's been about 100 years of research on retrieval practice or test effects, and we know a lot about it. First, it's most effective when it's followed by feedback. No surprise, right? Because if you fail to recall something or retrieve something correctly, you need to go back and restudy. So testing connected with restudy leads to best outcomes. It also is best when it requires recall, a retrieval from memory without support. Taking multiple choice tests, fill in the blank test, and so forth are better than just rereading, but it's even better if you're recalling all of the content from memory, using a more difficult or more effortful recall test. And also, it's most effective when responses are eventually correct. So for instance, when you're using flashcards, the students need to keep going, like testing themselves, oh, I didn't get that right, restudy, put it at the end, right? And then continue to go until they correctly recall it. It turns out students get much bigger bang, or a much better benefit to their learning when they correctly recall some than when they don't. Don't get me wrong, sometimes even when you don't correctly recall something, it actually potentiates or benefits subsequent restudy. But the biggest benefits tend to be when students go until they correctly recall the information. So what about implementing? Well, first way to implement, most students, or many students, like to use flashcards, and I highly recommend students continue using flashcards, okay? They're not only good for simple paired associates when you have a cue on one side and a simple target on the other, but also when you have a key term definition on one side and basically a relatively complex definition on the other. So flashcards can be a really effective way to utilize basically retrieval practice plus restudy. Another thing that students can do to help them use retrieval practice is take better notes. Okay? When I watch undergraduates taking notes in classes, it's horrific. I mean, they'll use every little inch of the paper that they have, filling it all up. You know, maybe they can't afford paper, something like that. Okay, and it turns out they should do just the opposite. For students in the audience who want to learn about how to take good notes, I highly recommend you go Google Cornell notes, and they'll describe how you can take these notes to support retrieval practice. What I tell my own students, okay, take very clean notes, and this is just forces and creations of physics notes, and note this is relatively dense, but the idea is you take notes only on one side of the paper, leaving the other side blank. And there you can copy over the key terms, and then when you come back to restudy, you don't merely just reread your notes, but you use these cues to help you practice retrieving. So you'd see, well, what are the 4 fundamental forces of creation? You have to write those down from memory, and then you can go evaluate the quality of your response by comparing it to the other side of your notes. Relatively straightforward, simple technique that most students don't utilize, but it can really boost their learning of course content. Another way that teachers can actually harness the power of testing is by something that my colleagues call a daily review. You know, you would typically call it a daily test, but again, students don't like to hear the T word, so instead it's just a review. In my courses, the first 5 to 10 minutes of every class, I give students a test. Okay? It's on the most important content that they've learned in the last week or two. This gives them an opportunity, if they correctly recall the information, to learn it that much better, but it also does give them a chance to basically evaluate what they're learning versus what they're not learning. Okay? And of course, I immediately give feedback, they can restudy, and at least for young freshman level courses, I use this as an opportunity to actually evaluate the quality of their note-taking. Because when they're missing things on these daily reviews, I ask them, well, why don't you check your notes? Because if the information isn't there, maybe you're not taking effective notes. So these are just a couple of many ways that retrieval practice can be implemented by not only students, but also by teachers. Now I want to make a simple distinction between the what versus when. Many of the strategies that we evaluated in our review of the literature were about what to do. Okay? Retrieval practice tells you what to do. You practice retrieving information from memory, and then you go and restudy, get feedback. Distributed practice is about when to do something. Okay? When do you schedule your practice? And probably no surprise, distributed, right, is kind of the definition is right in the name of the term, means spreading out study of the same content across time. Okay? So one example of distributed practice is, well, during session 1, you come and you study the relevant material as a student. Several days later, session 2, you restudy the same material. Session 3, you restudy the same material, you're probably getting the hang of this, you come back several days later, and wow, you get an exam. Okay? So it's just distributing these study sessions across time. The alternative to distributed practice is cramming. Okay? You look at your calendar, it's like, oh my God, there's a test tomorrow, I think I better pull an all-nighter, make some coffee, let's go for it, and this is what you get. Okay? Strangely enough, most students not only endorse using cramming technique most of the time, they also say it's the most effective technique. So what they believe is very effective is actually relatively ineffective. Don't get me wrong, many students can cram and squeak by a test, but as we all know, they'll quickly forget that information. They'll just lose it. So cramming kind of gives you the sense that you're learning. Yeah, you get the B you wanted, and then you just forget the material. Certainly, the educational system has more to give students than just quick learning and fast forgetting. So I'm going to show you one data set collected by Nate Cornell, 2009, that gives you a sense about the power of distributed practice. Again, like retrieval practice, distributed practice has been investigated for about 100 years. There are lots of data that show it. It's a really effective and potent strategy to learn. Nate had students learning basically vocabulary word pairs, and these were very difficult GRE terms that most students never need to know in their life, but yet if you're going to take the GRE, you have to study and learn them. Okay? Then he had test restudy trials. That is, everyone used the effective test and restudy technique. Okay? However, some of those students used it 8 times on one day. So if you think about flashcards, what they were doing is they were going through the flashcards 8 times. Okay? And after you go through the whole stack, you're done. Other students, they used those flashcards 2 times on each of 4 different days. So the use of those flashcards were distributed across time. So basically the same time on task, except in one context, students are cramming, and in the other context, students are distributing the same practice across time. And then one day later, he had the final test, where he just tested the students on all these difficult GRE terms. For those students who went through those deck of cards, cramming 8 times on one day, their overall performance was only about 22%. However, just by distributing the same amount of work across 4 different days, we see incredible boost in student retention and learning of this difficult content. Again, distributed practice is very potent. Distributed practice is absolutely essential for long-term retention of any kind. Okay? What really confuses me about many students is that in any other domain outside of education, they'll use distributed practice to get ready for stuff. Okay? For instance, if I have a dance recital in 2 weeks from now, I'm not going to wait till the night before to start practicing my dance moves. If I'm a basketball player and on the junior varsity team, I may not wait the day before the game to practice my layups and everything else, right? You distribute that practice across time. Yet most students cram when they're getting ready for exams. I have nothing against dance recitals, but I think most students should value education as much as they do performance. Okay? Distributed practice is most effective when the practice is distributed across sessions. Okay? So if a student has 4 hours to study, okay, they could decide the night before the exam even to use space practice within those 4 hours and just cram all their time in. But they're going to be much better off if they use those same 4 hours, and just spread them across 2 weeks before the exam, 1 hour at a time. Okay? Distributed practice is also most effective when it involves effective strategies. Okay? Certainly, distributing practice is great, but if all you're going to do is reread the material when you go back to it, you're not going to get your biggest bang for your buck. Okay? So you want to combine the when with a good what to do. So, we have a what to do, which is use retrieval practice until you get it right. Okay? And we have a when to do, which is distribute the use of retrieval practice until you get it right across time. Now, if these 2 strategies were to get married and have a baby, the baby would be successive relearning. Okay? And this is a particular strategy that hasn't been investigated a lot in literature, but we think it's extremely potent, and we know it's something that can benefit many students. And just to drive home this point, successive learning would be you're using this testing and restudy strategy. In the first session, you'll learn the material to a specific criterion. So maybe you'll go into get everything correct once. Session 2, you'll relearn the same material again using the same strategy. That is, you're relearning it. Session 3, and so forth. Okay, so you come back and you relearn the material. Why successive relearning is so critical? Because we know students forget. And one of the first individuals or cognitive psychologists that pointed out the importance of successive relearning was Harry Barrick. And what Harry said in 1979 was much of what is learned during a first exposure is forgotten during the interval between exposures and must be relearned after to become a part of semi-permanent knowledge. One can therefore conceive of the total acquisition or learning process as a cycle of acquisition or learning, loss, and then reacquisition. The idea is if you're just studying during a single session, yeah, you might squeak by on that test, but you're not going to retain it for a long period of time. That is, you forget, and then you need to go back and relearn. Now, I want to drive this point home by revisiting some data that I presented earlier. And these are the wonderful data by Andrew Butler. Okay. Note, very excited about this data set because look at how good practice tests are over restudy. However, note also, if we were assigning grades in this class, even the students who use the most effective strategy are getting C's and D's in this course, right? So we have 60% performance. And the idea is they forget the material and then they have to relearn it. And you need to keep utilizing this strategy until you retain the most important concepts over a long period of time. So just practice tests with restudy isn't sufficient. You need to use that strategy across time. And at least in 1979, Harry noted that memory research has not dealt directly with repeated acquisition processes. Well, that's great. And 79, a long time ago, so you'd think, well, there's probably a lot of research been done since then to basically show the power of successive relearning. Unfortunately, in 2006, Sapita and his colleagues noted that if the field of learning and memory is to inform educational practice, what is evidently needed is much less emphasis on convenient single session studies. Okay? So the work just hasn't been done. Now, I'm a cognitive psychologist. I know we have a lot of scientists in the auditorium right now. We all love convenient single session studies. I never want to stop doing that kind of work. But we decided about 3 or 4 years ago with my collaborator, Dr. Catherine Rawson, to start investigating basically successive relearning and how much it can benefit students. And I'm going to show you outcomes from 2 different studies. The first is focusing on paired associates and our friend the Swahili English translation equivalents. And during the first session, students studied 70 of these Swahili English translation equivalents utilizing testing and restudy. And some of them, like if this was a deck of flashcards, they went until they correctly recalled it once and they removed them from the stack. Some they went until they correctly recalled it 2 times, some 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay? So during that initial learning session, students had different criterion that they went to. Then they would come back to the laboratory 4 times. And during each of these relearning sessions, they basically restudied all of the items until they correctly recalled them once. Okay? And these sessions were basically spread out by 1 week delay between each session. So they're relatively long delays. And then relearning session, this is important, always began with recall. So then in session 3, we could evaluate how much extra boost you got from the prior relearning sessions. Now, it turns out that I'll admit that this kind of research is less convenient than single study session research. It takes a lot of effort to pull off. But it provides a really rich data set that can be really informative, and I wish I had time to unpack it all now. Instead, I'm just going to give you some highlights of this first study. Now, this first figure, I'm collapsing across all those different criterion learning on session 1 to 7. So I'm just averaging across all of that. So when you come back during the next session, you recall about 25% of those items. So there's a lot of loss, right, in that 1 week. But note, now you relearn those items again, and by just relearning them, you get a major boost in subsequent retention. If you have one extra relearning, successive relearning trial, you get yet another boost. Okay? And again, this shows a relatively potent influence of successive relearning for long-term retention. And what really impresses about these studies is when students come back to the laboratory for these relearning sessions, they take very little time. Relearning is quick, so not only does it have a relatively potent influence on the long-term retention, it really doesn't cost a lot with respect to how much time is being used. I think there's a lot cooler way to present these data, and that's what I'm going to do now, because I'm going to compare cramming versus distributing. Okay? And many of these items during the first session that was crammed, they went until they correctly recalled them twice. And a week later, they recalled 22%. But we also had some items that were in each session only correctly recalled once, right? And now those two correct recalls were just distributed across time. And by distributing them across time, you get a major boost in performance. Same amount of time, okay? Same amount of time, but over twice the performance level. We could look at this for, did you cram 3 times in one session or spread those out across basically 3 weeks? And again, we see another potent boost to long-term retention. We could play this game again, and the story just keeps getting better and better. The use of successive relearning is a really effective, not only time-wise, but also with respect to learning and retention-wise. Okay. Again, these are relatively straightforward, simple paired associates methodology, but we've also started applying this to introductory psychology. Here, we're working with a teacher who taught these large auditorium classes, over 400 students in these courses. And we asked the teacher, just give us concepts that you want these students to learn. Okay? That's about all the interaction we had with the teacher. Okay? She chose 64 different concepts that she wanted the students to learn. And these concepts are what, basically, they're any intro book to any intro class is just chock full of these important definitions that students need to learn. They're foundational for other courses. Now, 32 of these items for each student in the experiment, they used successive relearning with. And 32 items were baseline items. Okay? Baseline here is kind of business as usual. The students were on their own to learn them. They could do whatever they were supposed to do. The teacher said they should be learning them. They were important concepts. And as we probably can surmise, most students just crammed, right? For the successive relearning items, however, they actually did this in the laboratory, so they had to come to the lab. Okay? During initial learning, they basically just studied these concepts and then had test and restudy until they correctly recalled them each once. And then for each set of concepts, they came back to the lab 3 more times for these relearning sessions. Just to give you a sense of what happened if you were a student in this experiment, it's like a virtual flashcard program. When you came in on a relearning session, we'd ask you, well, what is the self-serving bias? The students would just do their best to type in the correct answer. Note that here we didn't need a verbatim correct. We really emphasized understanding of these concepts. So if they just came up with the correct gist, it was right. After they practiced retrieval, then they got feedback, and then they can restudy that in this context. So again, it's kind of a virtual flashcard program that keeps students on track. Importantly, the concepts the students were learning in the laboratory were synchronized with the lectures. So if Sharon was lecturing about social psychology, they started learning those social concepts in the lab that week, and then that extended out. The next week, maybe she was teaching learning and conditioning, and then they would start learning those concepts in the lab. So it was synchronized with what they were doing in the classroom. Also, this is great. We didn't even have to make up a test because the criterion test was their performance in the class. Okay, this is very important. We did not make up these questions. These are questions that the teacher made up, and they're difficult. Okay? None of the questions asked for verbatim recall of these definitions. About 30% had to do with basically memory for the key content, but 60% of these questions really were all about comprehending and applying that knowledge in unique context. So these multiple choice questions that she used are relatively challenging for students. So then we analyzed the students' exam scores, basically breaking them into those questions that tap items that were slated for successive relearning versus those that were just baseline control items. And what we found is that students did about 12% better on the in-class exam. They boosted their letter grade. like their grade by a letter. Okay. Relatively impressive and shows that this successive relearning can help students on relatively difficult conceptual style tests. Now, being a cognitive psychologist, we just couldn't stop there, so we brought them back to the lab to basically evaluate how much they would retain. And basically what we expected to happen for these baseline control items, those are the ones the students are just cramming in the night before as they're drinking coffee, right? So when we had them back to the lab and we gave them a much more difficult test, they have to recall the definition from memory. And we either had them come back 3 days after or 24 days after. We wanted to know what was the fate of the students' knowledge about these concepts. And it's pretty startling, okay? If they use successive relearning, their retention was not bad. After 24 days, they could recall 64% of that content, okay? In fact, they also relearn that information relatively quickly. Unfortunately, for those concepts that they did not use this technique in, I mean, one could question whether they even had the class. I mean, what's going on? They're just losing it all very quickly. So for important class content, I mean, it doesn't have to be all of it, but for the most important ideas and concepts in class, students should be utilizing this technique because it's essential to lead to long-term retention. Okay. So successive relearning really does produce long-term retention. It's essential for helping students not only learn content so they can remember it, but also comprehend it. And what I want to emphasize one more time is how relatively efficient successive relearning is. Admittedly, when the students in our intro psych experiment came into the lab the first time to initially learn those concepts, it took them some time, about 40 minutes to learn 8 concepts until they could recall them. But each next session, they relearn those items more quickly and more quickly. In fact, by the 3rd session, it only took them 1 minute to relearn each concept. But yet, look at the big boost they had in retention. Okay. What really was strange for us is the anecdotal comments by these students. They would come to the researcher or to us and say, I can't believe I could learn so much. I couldn't believe I could relearn so much so quickly. And for those of you who are researchers, you're not even going to believe this next thing. They were asking, can my friends sign up to take this experiment? That just doesn't happen. Right? Because they were seeing, wow, this is really helping me out. Can my friends use it? Well, it was an experiment, so we had to say, no, sorry, but you can outperform your friends, use this. Now, note, not a difficult technique. Students could do this on their own, right, in the dormitory using flashcards. So what about some challenges? One challenge is that students really aren't trained to set goals and to use effective strategies. It just doesn't happen. It's really not teachers' fault. They're trying to basically give students content, and they don't always think about, well, maybe students could also use strategies to help them learn that content. Okay? At Kent State, we do help them out. If you're a student at my university and you happen to go by an academic planner, this is what you learn. This is how we're going to get you ready for the college experience. And I'll underline this here. It says, use a time management tool like a planner, calendar, chronological logbook. I don't even know what that is. I mean, chart to keep track of due dates. I guess that's good advice. It doesn't seem that helpful to me. I mean, keep track of due dates. If I'm a student, it says, okay, I should write down when I'm going to have my test so I know when I can start cramming. Okay? It turns out, it's a nice calendar, it's a good academic planner. A couple weeks ago, I was out at a restaurant, and this is the advice I got. Planning is the prelude to successful action. I mean, that's just about as useful. I got a cookie with that one, right? Not so with the academic planner. Students, it turns out, even college students, need more guidance. They need more support to help them implement these relatively straightforward strategies in their classes. They need the experience and to feel that they work, to get the efficacy that they work, so they'll use them in other courses. And one of my colleagues in her methodology course basically just lays it out for them. So you're going to have a test on Tuesday at 2:15, okay? And that test is going to cover these 2 large subsets of materials. Set A, survey methods, observational methods, and so forth. Set B are multivariate correlational designs, experimental designs, and you're responsible for learning all of this. And then she gives them basically a calendar. Like, this is how you can use retrieval practice or successive relearning to help you learn this content. Okay. With the hopes that, of course, not only will they use this, but then they'll also implement the same kind of strategies, right, in other courses. And I think students really need this kind of guidance to begin with so they can understand how easy these techniques are to use as long as you do some planning, okay? And not just wait until the teacher says, hey, by the way, we're going to have a test next class. So a couple general conclusions. Study skills can improve student achievement. They just do. But I don't want to overstate the case. Okay? These kinds of strategies I'm describing today are not a panacea for all the educational woes. So when I'm showing you those original data from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, I don't think if students now have successive relearning in their pocket, distributed practice, we're going to see major changes in performance. Okay? But they do provide a partial solution. And many students underutilize these strategies, and if they're taught to use them, they will benefit from them. Also, another shout out for successive relearning. It really does produce durable learning, and it can be used extremely efficiently. And one thing that's been kind of implicit throughout this whole talk, but I want to really drive home, is that I think education reform needs to be evidence-based. Okay? Teachers, administrators, who are being sold the latest technique should be asking questions. Show me the evidence. Show me the data that it does show promise for improving students' learning, right, in the classroom. Okay. And I think that's the best way for reform that's going to help students across the entire globe. Thank you very much for listening tonight.